Hey, what's up? I'm Noah, and if you followed the channel for any amount of time, you know that I like to play a game called Risk of Rain 2. If you aren't familiar with the game, Risk of Rain 2 is a 3D action roguelike game where you play as a variety of survivors who crash land on a planet full of alien creatures, all of whom want you dead. The point of the game is to escape the planet in one piece by discovering and using various items hidden in chests that landed on the planet to defend yourself against the hordes of monsters. As I mentioned a second ago, Risk of Rain 2 is a roguelike game, games which are typically defined by their difficulty and their loss of progress upon losing at the game. Now, the title of this video is Conditioning in Risk of Rain 2. And if you've taken a psychology class or two, you're likely familiar with operant conditioning. This is the kind of conditioning where a specific behavior or behaviors are reinforced or punished in order to increase or decrease the frequency of said behaviors. Now, conditioning may seem like an antiquated way of explaining something as complex as learning how to play a video game, especially one as complicated as Risk of Rain 2. But in reality, conditioning can be useful for explaining many behaviors learned in video games, and it's been used by video game designers to silently teach players for decades. Here, I'm using Risk of Rain 2 as an example of how a video game can teach a player without a dedicated tutorial via conditioning, where conditioning actually lies at the heart of the game's design. Dying is really important in Risk of Rain 2. Not because you want to die, but for the exact opposite reason, you don't want to die. Death serves as the player's first and foremost motivation, and it shapes the player's behaviors by motivating them to adopt behaviors that avoid death, and abandon behaviors that lead to death sooner. Death in Risk of Rain 2 is what is known as a positive punishment in operant conditioning. Not positive in the sense that it's pleasant, but positive in the sense that something unpleasant is added. In this case, an unpleasant thing, which is losing your progress and your items, is added when you die. You could alternatively look at it as a negative punishment, something which takes away something pleasant. In this case, your progress and items are something pleasant, and dying takes those things away from you. But either way, it's not super important. All you need to know is that death is a punishment. Now, the amount of behaviors that lead to death in Risk of Rain 2 are, frankly, quite vast, and the amount of behaviors that avoid death are comparatively fewer. Let's run through an example in-game to show how it works. Let's say I activate the teleporter, which is required to advance to the next level, and the game spawns the Wandering Vagrant boss. I'm doing some good damage to the boss, but then, it starts charging up, and I don't know what to do. I try to kill it before it finishes charging, but I fail, and the Vagrant's energy blast kills me. This behavior, which is trying to kill the Vagrant before the energy blast goes off, leads to me dying and is therefore punished. I will be less likely to repeat this behavior in the future because I've been conditioned to assume that trying to kill the Vagrant before the blast goes off will lead to me dying. And indeed, it usually will. Now, let's say I start over and activate the teleporter again, and the game spawns the Wandering Vagrant again. I remember that trying to kill the boss first is not a viable strategy, and I realize that hiding behind cover might protect me from the Vagrant's energy blast. It works, and I'm able to kill the boss without dying. This behavior is negatively reinforced because it helped me avoid something unpleasant. In this case, the unpleasant thing is dying. The example I've made here is admittedly oversimplified, as in reality, the Wandering Vagrant has more attacks than just the big energy blasts, and there will be other monsters to contend with while you charge the teleporter, but it gets the point across and the system generalizes across the whole game. If you think I'm just pulling this idea out of nowhere, firstly, that's very fair. But this idea of conditioning in video games has been present for years. In the book Learning by Playing Video Gaming and Education, Blumberg writes, "Reinforcement can occur in two ways. Positive reinforcement occurs by gaining something desirable, as when working earns money, or when one clears a level of a video game and gets access to new levels or skills in the game. Negative reinforcement occurs by escaping or avoiding some negative outcome or noxious stimulus." Blumberg talks about reinforcement here, but the point I'm making about punishment is very similar and translates to video games in all kinds of places. There are two reasons I chose Risk of Rain 2 as my example for this video. One, I know way too much about it, and the second reason is much more valid and interesting. As I mentioned during the introduction, Risk of Rain 2 is an action game, a difficult one at that. This is important because action games tend to lend themselves well to this kind of learning and conditioning. In an article from CS Green back in 2012, they wrote, "First, video games incorporate many characteristics of good pedagogy before those discussed above, including the ratio of massed versus distributed practice, personalized difficulty levels, just right increment steps during learning, fun, and engagement. As previously noted, action games also include extremely effective reinforcement and reward scheduling, which can be critical for efficient learning." Now, if you're like me and don't know what the word pedagogy means, it just means the method or practice of teaching, and it's not really relevant for our discussion anyway. Most of what Green says is very descriptive of Risk of Rain 2. The game certainly has varying difficulty levels for the player to choose, and while I wouldn't call them just right steps, learning does occur incrementally by repeatedly dying and learning until the player has built up the knowledge necessary to beat the game. Risk of Rain 2 also has incredibly effective reinforcement/punishment, as we discussed previously with dying. The overall difficulty of the game is important too. Even on the easiest difficulty, Risk of Rain 2 can be fairly unforgiving for first-time players. This is actually a good thing though, as the difficulty encourages players to reach a bit further each attempt. In another article called Learning by Design, Good Video Games as Learning Machines by James Paul Gee, he wrote, "Learning works best when new challenges are pleasantly frustrating in the sense of being felt by learners to be at the outer edge of, but within their regime of competence. That is, these challenges feel hard but doable. Furthermore, learners feel and get evidence that their effort is paying off in the sense that they can see, even when they fail, how and if they are making progress." Evidence of progress is easy to find in Risk of Rain 2, from how long you survived, how many stages you've cleared, and eventually, how frequently you managed to win a run. All of these things, the conditioning, the structure of the game as an action game, and the difficulty all work together to incrementally teach the player how to play Risk of Rain 2. All without ever telling the player how to play the game.